Hello everyone and welcome to this tutorial by Code by the Grace. Now in this tutorial, I will be going through functions. Okay. Now functions are things that are used in everyday coding. Okay. Functions are very, very important because without functions, you copy the same code and use it over and over and over again. So what functions helps us to do is you define one block of code and then you can use it over and over and over again. In Python, how do you define functions? You define functions this way. Define, okay? And then we have greet, for example. And then we can just print out hello world. So what this would do is we've actually defined a function and our function is called greet. And inside our function, we are printing hello world. Now, the key here to understand is that the this def here is a keyword that stands the function definition, and then the greet is actually the function's name, and the brackets indicates parameters. Now in this particular example, we don't have parameters here, but we're going to look at parameters later on. And then remember that if you're using a function, you always have to indent, okay, the body of the code. So that's how you actually create a function. Now, why are functions important? Because let's say, for example, I wanted to print out hello world, and I have to keep on printing hello world, hello world, hello world. In this example, because I've defined a function, I do not have to repeat the greet function again. So if I wanted to use my function, all I have to do is just call greet. Okay. And then when I print out greet, it will print out hello world. Now I can use greet over and over again because it's already a function that I've created. So I can use it over and over and over again. Now, if you write a function and you do not call it, your function will never execute. So it's always important to remember that when you create a function, you have to call the function to use. So our next example is we're going to create a function for a basic adding two numbers together. So let me define another function here. So define, let's say, add numbers, for example, okay? And then in our add numbers, we're going to define two variables. Number one equals 5, number 2 equals 5, and then we're going to do a total equals num1 plus num2, and then we can say print sum is the total. So what this function is just a simple function where we're adding two numbers together. And what we can do is, if we wanted to use our function, we can just call it add numbers. And then we have to remember to call this brackets. Okay. Now, when I click on play, you would see that it gives me the sum is 10. If I can call my function again, and then it will still give me the sum is 10. Now, this is great as a starter, but really what we want to do is we want to turn this add function from just a static add numbers function to a function that becomes very dynamic. Okay, so this is the part where it gets quite interesting. So this is where we introduce something we call a parameter. Okay, now a parameter is the name of a function that it's a name for information that a function can receive. Okay, so in this particular example, we have add numbers. Every time we run add numbers, it's always going to add 5 and give us 5 plus 5 equals the total. But what if we wanted to change this add numbers? We pass in a parameter. Parameter, like I said, is the name of a function of an information that a function can receive. Think of it as a placeholder inside a function, and then when you pass something in, it replaces that placeholder. So let's say, for example, we wanted to change our number one is we want to change our greet function to receiving a name. So instead of always saying hello world, we can pass in a parameter. Okay, so I'll pass in name here, and then inside my hello world, I can just say hello, uh, let's say hello, and then we can say my name is the name. Okay, so what this will do here is when we pass in whatever we pass in here, it will replace this name as it. So we'll run greet, then we'll pass in, for example, Kofi. Okay, what you should see is you should see that it will say hello world, my name is Kofi. So let's run that. Can you see here? Hello world, my name is Kofi. So what we've done is we've used a parameter, we've passed a parameter into our greet function. Now, something to notice here is when you are creating your function, the placeholder that you're passing in is called a parameter. When you are using your function, we actually call this an argument. So an argument is the actual value that you pass into a function when you call it. What it does is that it replaces the parameter inside a function. So when it hasn't been used, it's called a parameter. The value that you pass in is actually called an argument. So in this case, I can actually replace Kofi. I can use greet over again, and I can say Emmanuel. I can say Kwesi here, and I can use my function over and over and over again. Now, remember, here, when we're using it, it's called a parameter. The actual value we're passing is called argument. Okay, so that is the difference between a parameter and an argument. Okay, so parameter, again, the placeholder defined inside the function header, and then argument is the actual value when the function is called. Okay, and you can have multiple parameters and multiple arguments. Of course, the number of parameters is equivalent to the number of arguments that you pass in sometimes. So in this example, we want to modify our add numbers because we don't want to keep printing out 5 plus 5. Rather, we want to print out, let's say, a dynamic number that we may pass in. So what I will do is I'll pass in A, comma, B. Now, A and B are now our parameters, which are placeholders. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace 5 with an A, and I'm going to replace 5, again, number 2 with a B. So what this would do is it's acting as a placeholder, which means that it's expecting us to pass in an argument. So when I use my add numbers, I'll just pass in 5 and 10. So how this code runs, okay, I'm running a function called add numbers. I'm going to pass in a 5. When I pass in this 5, it replaces this placeholder. So that becomes 5 and here becomes 10. So in the end, we end up with an additional function which takes in 5 and 10 and adds it together. And we can repeat this over and over again. We can change our plus. Remember, if we copy this and we change here, okay, and we can change this into a times like this. And then whenever we need to change it, we can, instead of saying add, we can say multiply numbers, and then we will use multiply numbers. So in this case, we'll end up with 50 because 5 times 10 becomes 50. And that is how you you create a function without a parameter and a function with a parameter. Now, another thing to also understand is that you can actually pass in default values. So let's say, for example, a user ends up using our multiply numbers function. Okay, let me just delete the multiply functions and just use add numbers. So let's say a user was to run add numbers and the user runs our code. The user is going to get an error because they did not pass in any argument, right? Remember that our function is expecting us to pass in 2 values.